Hello and thanks for joining us for this brief video on cash reserves, policies and procedures, how and why. Let's look at a few questions which pertain to cash reserve policies. First of all, why do we keep cash reserves? In a business environment like the current one, we should be concerned about stability or even continuity of our business, and not just our business, but also employees who could be very affected. So the next question is, how much should we hold in reserve? And the answer is, it depends. Depends on the size of your business, depends on the risk appetite of your leadership team, but more often than not, we look at our average operating costs, which try to keep perhaps 3 months at a minimum of the average operating costs in reserves. In the current environment, you may want to be a bit more aggressive than this and keep a larger number, say 6 months worth of cash flow. What comprises average operating costs? Again, this will depend to some degree on what business you're in. Certainly the recurring predictable expenses should be incorporated in the average operating costs. These things might be rent, subscriptions, regular salary. But if you're in a high growth phase or a changing business environment, you may need to make some additional provisions for regular expenses that you might incur and hold these in reserve as well. Another question is, what are the triggers that enable you to access these cash reserves? These arise from an unanticipated loss of funding. Let's say you have a lender who is no longer able to lend you cash, or an investor who can no longer provide funding to your business. Perhaps it's from your customers who are no longer able to buy your goods and services. A large customer or many of your customers may suffer that. You'll have a loss of revenue causing you to dip into your cash reserves at this point. The other thing that may occur is a sudden increase in expenses, especially in an unanticipated expense. You might have thought you only needed 10 people for a particular project, but it turns out you need 15, 17 or maybe 20 people. And of course there are times where we suffer unbudgeted expenses. Perhaps you lose a lawsuit or some other extraordinary event in the business which was not foreseen and might tap into cash reserves at this point. But keep in mind, cash reserves are not there simply because the business isn't going very well to eliminate an ongoing budget gap. We use reserves only for extraordinary situations, and that's what your cash reserve policy should say. Kind of an obvious point, but where do you keep your cash reserves? It's important to get really disciplined about this and keep them in a segregated account. Don't mingle these funds with your other cash resources. And if you're going to the trouble of creating cash reserves and cash reserves policies, then you should also delegate authority to a particular individual who you should apply to access to cash reserves and obtain approval from somebody. The finance committee, the board, the CEO, the management team, and then report on how those cash reserves are used, and importantly, how they'll be replenished into the business. These are some of the basic aspects of cash reserve policies. We hope you benefited from that, and we look forward to having you on our future videos. Thank you.